I'm 60 years old now, and I want to speak to you directly for a moment. Just as a woman who finally understands what happened to her and wishes she had understood it sooner. Most people think control is loud. They imagine raised voices, threats, force, something obvious enough that you'd recognize it immediately. That wasn't my experience. What happened to me came quietly. So quietly that for a long time, I didn't even know it was happening. I thought I was being helped. I thought I was being supported. I thought I was being loved. Before I go any further, let me say this. If stories like this matter to you, if you care about hearing the kind of truth people don't usually say out loud, you might want to stay with me. I want you to like this video and hit the subscribe. It motivates me a lot, and I can speak to you. I'm not here to sell you anything. I just don't want this story to disappear the way my voice almost did. For most of my life, I believed that if you did things the right way, life would be steady. You raise your children, you keep your marriage together, you make sacrifices, you don't complain too much, you don't make things harder than they need to be. I was married to Marcos for decades. We built a life that looked solid from the outside. No chaos, no scandal, no drama people could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." And our son, my son, grew up watching all of that, watching me be the one who adjusted, the one who smoothed things over, the one who made sure everything kept moving forward, even when it cost me something. When he got older, he started helping more. At least that's what I told myself. He handled things that felt overwhelming. Paperwork, decisions, conversations I was tired of having. It felt like relief. No one warns you that relief can be dangerous. No one tells you that the moment you stop deciding for yourself, someone else will be happy to do it for you. At first, it was small. Suggestions, advice, a tone that said, "Let me take care of that." And because he was my son, because I trusted him, I didn't question it. Why would I? I had raised him. I had sacrificed for him. I had taught him right from wrong. And he spoke with such certainty, such confidence. Meanwhile, Marcos stayed quiet. He didn't argue. He didn't intervene. He told himself, and me, that keeping the peace was more important than asking questions. And I believed that too. I didn't notice when my opinions started coming out softer. I didn't notice when I began checking his reactions before finishing my sentences. I didn't notice when decisions were already made by the time I was informed about them. That's the thing about control when it comes wrapped in family. It doesn't announce itself. It blends in with care, with concern, with what's best for you. I still thought I was the same woman, still thought I was choosing this. I didn't know yet that I was slowly being trained to doubt my own voice. And this was only the beginning. Control doesn't arrive all at once. If it did, most of us would push back. We would recognize it, name it, stop it. What happened instead was slower than that. After my son started helping, my life became easier in ways that felt responsible. Bills were handled before I even thought about them. Appointments were scheduled without me having to remember. Conversations that made my chest tighten were suddenly no longer mine to have. At first, I felt grateful. I told myself this was what it looked like when your children grew up and stepped in. I said things like, "He's just trying to make sure I'm okay." And people nodded when I said it. That made it feel true. Marcos was relieved too. He had never liked conflict, never liked tension. When our son took charge, the house got quieter, decisions were quicker. Problems seemed to disappear before they reached us. Peace can be convincing when you've spent years managing everyone else's emotions. I didn't notice the shift right away. It was subtle. The way my son would finish my sentences, the way he'd answer questions that were directed at me. The way he'd say, "Don't worry about that," before I even realized I was worrying. He wasn't harsh. That's important. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. His voice stayed calm, reasonable, confident. That made it harder to question. If I hesitated, he'd remind me how stressful things used to be. If I disagreed, he'd frame it as concern. "Mom, I don't think that's a good idea. Mom, this is complicated. Let me handle it. Mom, trust me." And I did. Slowly, without deciding to, I stopped preparing my thoughts, stopped rehearsing what I wanted to say. Because there was always someone ready to speak for me, I told myself this was temporary, that I was just tired, that 60 years of carrying everyone else had finally caught up to me. What I didn't admit, not even to myself, was how relieved I felt not to be responsible anymore. Responsibility can feel heavy when you've carried it your whole life. And when someone offers to take it from you, it can feel like kindness. But kindness doesn't make you smaller. I remember moments, small, ordinary ones, where I felt a flicker of discomfort. A decision I didn't fully understand but went along with anyway. A choice that didn't feel right in my body even though it sounded logical. I ignored those moments. I told myself I was overthinking, that this was what aging looked like, that trusting your family was the smart thing to do. Marcos would glance at me sometimes like he wanted to say something. Then he'd look away. He told himself it wasn't his place, that interfering would only cause trouble. So the house stayed calm, and I stayed quiet. Eventually, I noticed something that scared me, not sharply, but slowly. When people asked me what I wanted, my mind went blank, not because I didn't care, but because I hadn't been asked in so long. I had gotten used to reacting instead of deciding, agreeing instead of choosing, nodding instead of speaking. That's when I realized something had changed. My son didn't need to tell me what to do anymore. I had already learned how to adjust myself. That's the most dangerous stage of control, when no one has to enforce it, when you start doing the work for them. And by the time I understood that, I was no longer sure where my voice ended and his began. I wish I could tell you there was a moment where I suddenly understood everything. A sentence someone said, an argument. A line crossed so clearly I couldn't ignore it. But that's not how it happened. What changed first wasn't my situation, it was my inner world. I started noticing how careful I'd become. Careful with my words, careful with my tone, careful not to sound confused, emotional, or difficult. I began editing myself before I spoke, not because anyone told me to, but because I had learned what made things smoother. If I questioned something, there would be a pause, a sigh, a look that said I was making things harder than they needed to be. So I stopped questioning. If I pushed back, the conversation would turn into a lecture about stress, safety, responsibility, about how much everyone was already doing for me. So I stopped pushing. I told myself I was being mature. There's a special kind of shame that comes with being treated like you're fragile when you don't feel fragile inside. No one insults you directly. They just speak slowly. They repeat themselves. They check to see if you understand. And each time, a small part of you shrinks. I started doubting things I had always trusted in myself. My memory, my instincts, my judgment. I'd think, that doesn't sound right, then immediately wonder if I was mistaken. I'd feel uneasy, then explain it away before it could form into words. The most unsettling part was how reasonable everything sounded. Nothing felt abusive, nothing felt cruel. If someone had asked me then whether I was being controlled, I would have laughed. I would have said, of course not. They're just looking out for me. That's how control survives. By never announcing itself, Marcos noticed the change before I did, not in dramatic ways. In quiet glances, in the way he'd ask, "Are you okay with this?" after decisions were already settled. Sometimes I was, sometimes I wasn't. But even when I wasn't, I'd say yes, because saying no felt heavier than living with discomfort. I stopped initiating conversations that mattered to me, stopped bringing up concerns unless I was absolutely sure they were justified. Stopped trusting my emotional reactions. When did I become someone who needed permission to feel uncertain? That question stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. I remember standing in my own kitchen one afternoon, listening to my son explain a decision he'd made about my life. He spoke confidently, calmly, as if this were obvious. And I nodded, not because I agreed, but because correcting him felt exhausting. That scared me more than anything else, because exhaustion is how control wins, not through force, through weariness. I started realizing how much energy it took to remain invisible, to stay agreeable, to avoid friction, and how little energy was left for me. At night, when the house was quiet, I'd feel something surface, a discomfort I couldn't name, a thought I didn't finish. I'd push it down quickly, tell myself I was overreacting, that I was lucky, that many women had it worse. That comparison became my silence. But the truth was, I no longer felt like the main character in my own life. I felt like a background presence, someone whose role was to accommodate, not decide. I wasn't afraid of my son. That's important to say. I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped cooperating. Afraid of tension, afraid of conflict, afraid of being labeled ungrateful. And that fear kept me compliant long before anyone had to ask. That's when I understood something I didn't want to face. By the time control feels uncomfortable, it has usually already succeeded. And I was standing right in the middle of it. Quiet, uncertain, and slowly forgetting who I had been before my voice became optional. Fear doesn't need to raise its voice to be effective. In my house, it learned to speak calmly. By the time I recognized it, fear had already become part of our daily language. Not the obvious kind, not panic or dread, the reasonable kind, the kind that sounds like logic. My son didn't say, "You can't." He said, "That's risky." He didn't say, "You're wrong." He said, "You might not be seeing the whole picture." And every time, it sounded sensible. Fear showed up disguised as protection, as efficiency, as being realistic about my age, my energy, my limits. It told me I was safer when someone else decided. Whenever I hesitated, fear reminded me of what could go wrong, what I might lose, how complicated things could become if I insisted on doing things my way. It never asked me to give up everything, just a little more control each time. I started measuring my choices by consequences instead of meaning, by how much trouble they might cause, by how uncomfortable they would make other people. That's when I realized fear had found its favorite tool, guilt. If I spoke up, I felt selfish. If I questioned decisions, I felt difficult. If I wanted something different, I felt irresponsible. Fear framed obedience as gratitude, and I absorbed that lesson quietly. Marcos tried, in his own limited way, to keep things smooth. He'd say, "Let's not make this bigger than it is." He meant well. He thought avoiding conflict was kindness. But avoidance has consequences too. The more he stayed silent, the more fear had room to grow. Not just in me, in the space between us. I began to notice how often I was being reminded of what I couldn't handle anymore, how often decisions were justified by my age, how frequently my past competence was spoken about like something nostalgic. "You've done enough. You shouldn't have to worry about this. Let us take care of it." Those words sound gentle, but they can be suffocating when you still feel capable inside. Fear also taught me to anticipate reactions, to predict disapproval before it happened, to adjust myself preemptively. I learned when to stay quiet, when to agree quickly, when to smile and move on. Eventually, no one had to pressure me anymore. I pressured myself. That's when control becomes almost invisible, when it lives inside your own decisions. I remember one moment clearly. I suggested something small. Nothing dramatic, just a preference. The room went quiet for a second, too long. My son responded patiently, explaining why that wouldn't work, why it didn't make sense, why it would complicate things. He wasn't wrong exactly, but I noticed how quickly my desire disappeared, how fast I replaced it with understanding. That speed frightened me because it meant I had stopped fighting for myself without even realizing it. Fear had trained me well. It convinced me that harmony was more important than honesty, that peace was more valuable than participation, that being easy to live with mattered more than being heard. And the cost of that belief was subtle but heavy. I no longer trusted my discomfort. I treated it like an inconvenience instead of information. Every time I swallowed a thought, fear grew stronger. Every time I chose quiet over truth, it settled in deeper. Fear didn't cage me. It didn't have to. It simply made the outside world feel too dangerous, and the inside world feel smaller and smaller. By then, control wasn't something being done to me anymore. It was something I was helping maintain. Because fear had convinced me that this was the safest way to live. And that realization came with a weight I couldn't ignore much longer. People expect awakening moments to be dramatic. A confrontation, a raised voice, a door slammed hard enough to change everything. That wasn't mine. Mine arrived quietly, the way truth often does when it's been waiting a long time. It happened on an ordinary day, no argument, no tension in the air. My son was explaining a plan he had already put into motion. Something about my future, something that involved me, but didn't require my agreement. He spoke confidently, listing reasons, benefits, safeguards. He had clearly thought it through. And as I listened, I felt something shift. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. For the first time, I noticed that he wasn't asking what I wanted. He was informing me of what would happen. And for the first time, I noticed how familiar that felt. I realized then that my consent had slowly been replaced by compliance. That nodding had become easier than participating. That silence had started to feel like peace. I looked at Marcos while my son was talking. He was listening too. Quiet. Tired. In that moment, I understood something painful. I wasn't afraid of my son. I was afraid of losing my place. My place as a good mother, as someone who didn't cause trouble, as someone who was easy to care for. I had been performing gratitude instead of living truth. That realization hit deeper than any argument ever could, because it meant I had been cooperating with my own erasure. I thought back to the woman I used to be, the one who made decisions, the one who trusted her instincts, the one who spoke even when her voice shook. When had I decided that version of me was no longer appropriate? The answer unsettled me. I hadn't decided. I had adjusted over and over, quietly, conveniently, until I fit the shape everyone else needed me to be. That day, when my son finished explaining, he looked at me expectantly, waiting for agreement. And I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to make things easy, to say yes, to smooth it over. But something stopped me. Not courage. Not yet. Honesty. I heard myself say, slowly, carefully, I need time to think about this. The room changed. Not dramatically. Subtly. My son looked surprised. Marcos shifted in his seat. No one argued. No one shouted. But I could feel the tension underneath, the discomfort of resistance. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't rush to relieve it. That single sentence cost me more than I expected. Guilt rushed in immediately. Fear followed close behind. I worried about being seen as difficult, as ungrateful, as someone who was suddenly changing. But beneath all of that was something else. Relief. Because I had finally interrupted the pattern. That moment didn't free me. It didn't fix anything overnight, but it cracked the illusion. I saw clearly that the control I was living under wasn't maintained by strength. It was maintained by my silence. And once I understood that, I knew something else too. If I wanted my life back, I would have to tolerate discomfort, not just theirs. Mine. The truth is, awakening doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels destabilizing. Once I stopped automatically agreeing, everything became harder. Conversations took longer, silences stretched. The calm I had protected for years began to crack. And I was the one blamed for the change, not directly. No one said, "You're the problem." But I could feel it in the air. My son grew more careful with his words, polite, measured, disappointed. Marcos tried to mediate, suggesting compromise before I'd even finished speaking. Everyone wanted things to go back to how they were. I understood why. The old version of me was easier. She didn't question. She didn't delay decisions. She didn't ask uncomfortable questions. But I couldn't be her anymore. Each time I paused, instead of agreeing, fear rushed in. It told me I was being selfish, that I was disrupting harmony. that I was ungrateful for everything my son had done. Sometimes I believed it. I second-guessed myself constantly, replayed conversations in my head, wondered if I'd overreacted. But I kept noticing something important. Every time I spoke honestly, even quietly, I felt more like myself. Not happier, not calmer, more present. That presence came with a cost. Tension replaced ease, distance replaced closeness, and guilt followed me like a shadow. My son began framing my resistance as concern. "Mom, I just don't want you to get overwhelmed. Mom, we're only trying to help." Those words used to stop me. Now they made me pause. Because help doesn't require obedience. I started setting small boundaries, nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive. "I'll handle that. I'm not comfortable with this yet. I need to understand before I agree." Each sentence felt heavier than it should have. Marcos struggled the most. He wanted peace. He wanted everything to settle back into familiarity. We argued quietly at night, not about my son, but about tension, about change, about why I couldn't just let things be. I told him something I had never said out loud before. "I don't feel like myself anymore." That sentence hung between us, because it named something we had both been avoiding. I wasn't trying to take control from anyone. I was trying to return to myself. Progress wasn't clean or consistent. Some days I retreated. Some days I stayed silent again. But I noticed the difference immediately when I did. Silence felt heavier now, like a betrayal. I started trusting my discomfort instead of dismissing it. Started treating unease as information, not weakness. That shift changed everything. I realized control had thrived not because I was incapable, but because I had been willing to disappear to keep everyone else comfortable. And once I stopped disappearing, the dynamic changed, not dramatically, slowly. The power in the room redistributed, not because anyone handed it back, but because I reached for it myself. I wasn't reclaiming authority, I was reclaiming authorship. My life wasn't something to be managed. It was something to be lived. That understanding didn't make things easier, but it made them honest. And honesty, I was learning, is far more demanding than silence. By now, I had begun to understand something I had avoided for years. Fear and control are quiet predators. They don't announce themselves with shouting or chaos. They wait, patient, until your voice softens, until your decisions are preempted, until your presence is optional. I looked at my life, my family, and realized the cost. Not in mistakes, not in losses, not in anger, but in the fragments of myself I had surrendered. The moments I didn't speak. The choices I let slip. The life I had been living for someone else without even realizing it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. It was subtle. Everyday small adjustments had become a pattern, a habit I carried like a second skin, a skin that was easier to wear than confrontation, easier than conflict, easier than being fully seen. I had to face the truth. I had allowed my own son to hold the reins over parts of my life that were mine alone. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to force me. I had been doing it for him, for Marcos, for everyone else. And the weight of that realization was suffocating. Not in the way that makes you collapse, in the way that makes you question every choice you thought was yours. Every decision, every deferment, every silence. I remember sitting one evening in my favorite chair, the one by the window where the sunlight always hit just right. I looked at Marcos and my son, both unaware of the battle quietly unfolding inside me, and I felt the stirrings of something long forgotten, my own voice. It was faint, fragile, hesitant, but unmistakably mine. Before I go any further, I want to pause and say this. If you've stayed with me this far, if you're watching and feeling the weight of this story, please like, subscribe, whatever feels natural to you. I don't want to interrupt the truth I'm telling, but I want this story to reach people who need to hear it. People like me, who didn't know what to notice until it was almost too late. I began small, quietly asserting boundaries I had long ignored, speaking up in ways that didn't feel natural at first. saying no to plans I didn't want to attend, expressing my opinion even when I anticipated disagreement. Not for rebellion, not for defiance, but for existence. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't pretty. I stumbled, I doubted myself. I felt guilt. I questioned whether I was overreacting. Sometimes I retreated, but slowly, inch by inch, I reclaimed my space. I felt more present in my own life than I had in decades. I started to notice the subtle things I had stopped feeling: joy, curiosity, anticipation, even fear. But fear that belonged to me, not the one imposed by others. Marcos adjusted. He watched. He learned to speak differently, to notice, to respect. My son, still my son, began to understand that I was no longer willing to be quiet, no longer willing to defer endlessly. He adapted too, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes awkwardly. But change, when it comes from truth, cannot be ignored. And that, I realized, was the lesson worth sharing. Control is quiet. Control is patient. But reclaiming yourself, your voice, your choices, your life, is even quieter at first and infinitely more powerful once it takes hold. I want you to feel what I felt. The weight of realization, the fear of change, the exhilaration of reclaiming yourself piece by piece. Because this isn't just my story, it is a story for anyone who has let comfort, duty, or fear dictate their life quietly. For anyone who has slowly watched themselves shrink to fit expectations. For anyone who has forgotten what it feels like to truly participate in their own life. One last thing before I leave you. If you've stayed with me, if you've listened to every word, I want to thank you. It means you understand why this matters. It means you are paying attention. And it means that, just maybe, you'll notice where fear is quietly shaping your choices and decide differently. Fear will never admit its role. It will let you blame yourself. It will whisper that it was your fault, that you waited too long, that it's too late. But it's not too late. Not if you notice it in time. So here's what I leave you with. Your life belongs to you, not to your children, not to your spouse, not anyone else who thinks they know what's best. You get to speak, you get to act, you get to feel alive. I did it slowly, painfully, carefully, but I did it. And for the first time in decades, I am no longer just surviving. I am participating. I am present. I am remembering what it feels like to be alive.